Julia flung her plate across the restaurant, and it struck the black waiter squarely in the chest. Sauce and food splattered across his black uniform, dripping over the red logo stitched above his heart. The room fell silent. Gasps rippled through the diners as forks paused mid-air and conversations stopped. Every eye in the restaurant turned toward the scene, some in shock, others in disbelief. The black waiter, only 17, froze in place, tray still in his hands. His chest heaved as a wave of humiliation slammed over him, heavier than the plate itself. Every careful step he had taken delivering the order, every polite smile he had offered, every ounce of effort he had poured into doing his job right seemed meaningless. In an instant, his uniform was ruined, his pride splattered across his chest. Yet he stood rooted to the spot, unsure whether to run or fight, unsure whether he even could. Julia leaned back in her chair, smirk playing at her lips, completely unbothered by the chaos she had caused. Her red dress shimmered under the lights, bold and commanding, as if the room belonged entirely to her. Her fingers tapped idly on her phone, scrolling with an air of superiority that dared anyone to challenge her. This had been deliberate, a display meant to humiliate, to assert dominance, to make someone else feel small. The restaurant remained suspended in tension. Other customers shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether to intervene or pretend nothing had happened. The staff froze, trapped between protocol and fear. Some avoided eye contact out of nerves. Others turned away in shame at not knowing what to do. But the black waiter did not move. His hands shook as he attempted to brush off the mess, but the more he touched it, the more it spread. The red sauce mocked him, a tangible symbol of disrespect, yet beneath it, a quiet resolve began to rise. Through the corner of his eye, he noticed movement near the back hallway. The door opened and Angela, the manager's daughter, stepped into the dining room. Her yellow dress caught the light as she moved, bright and unyielding, her presence calm but authoritative. She had seen what had happened and now walked decisively toward the scene, her gaze fixed on Julia and the black waiter alike. The waiter's eyes fell to the floor. Relief and nervousness warred within him. Relief because someone had come to intervene. Nervousness because he did not know what Angela would do. Her steps were deliberate, steady, unafraid. The air around her seemed to thrum with an invisible authority. She stopped beside him, close enough to shield him without touching. Her gaze locked on Julia. The room seemed to hold its breath. Julia's smug expression faltered slightly. She had expected shock and submission from her target, but not this, not the unwavering, poised intervention of someone in charge. The tables had shifted. The audience had shifted. Her unearned confidence began to wobble under the weight of scrutiny. The black waiter straightened imperceptibly, emboldened by Angela's presence. Though he was covered in food, though humiliation still burned on his skin, he realized he was no longer alone. Someone was watching, someone who would ensure he was treated fairly. He drew in a silent breath, his chest rising with determination rather than shame. Angela's silence spoke louder than any words could. Her eyes conveyed judgment, fairness, and an unwavering promise. Cruelty would not be tolerated, and arrogance would face consequences. Julia, for the first time that afternoon, seemed to realize her actions had weight beyond the moment, that she had been seen, that she had been challenged in the most undeniable way. The spilled food on the floor, the ruined uniform, the stunned onlookers, they became symbols of something larger. An act meant to humiliate had been met with authority. Justice, subtle but firm, had entered the room. The black waiter felt a shift inside himself. He could reclaim his dignity even before the confrontation fully played out. Around them, the diners whispered softly. Some eyes lingered on Julia, noting the crack in her composure. Some silently celebrated the presence of Angela, recognizing the courage it took to step into a tense situation. And some, like the black waiter, realized that witnessing justice could empower them even in their most vulnerable moments. Julia's fingers twitched on her phone, her confidence eroding as she sensed that the room no longer revolved around her whims. She had underestimated the ripple of consequences set in motion by her actions. Angela's silent authority had created a buffer, a shield that allowed the black waiter to stand tall despite his ruined uniform. Time seemed suspended. The black waiter's chest rose and fell, steadier now, as he felt the first hints of empowerment replacing the sting of humiliation. The lesson was clear. Cruelty could never go unanswered when someone chose to act with principle. The restaurant slowly returned to motion, though the tension lingered. Customers adjusted their posture, aware that something significant had occurred. Julia rose slightly, attempting to reclaim her composure, but the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The spilled food, once the focal point, had become secondary to a larger truth that actions have consequences, and no one is untouchable. The black waiter remained upright, covered in sauce, yet dignified. Angela stayed beside him, her presence unwavering. The lesson of the day, that no act of arrogance can escape scrutiny, had already been delivered. And for the first time since the attack, the black waiter realized he had not been broken. He had survived humiliation, empowered by intervention, and reminded that justice does not always come loudly, but it arrives nonetheless. Julia's smug expression faltered as Angela stopped beside the black waiter. The room had shifted, the quiet judgment of diners and the weight of Angela's presence pressed down like an invisible force. Julia had expected compliance, maybe surprise, but not a young boy standing firm beside a girl who radiated authority. The black waiter's chest rose and fell, steadying. Though his uniform was still stained and his pride stung, he felt the smallest spark of courage flicker inside him. He was not alone anymore. Angela's presence beside him was more than protection. It was validation. She had silently declared that cruelty would not go unchecked. That statement, wordless but undeniable, changed the dynamic in the room entirely. Julia shifted in her seat, attempting to regain her composure. Her red dress caught the overhead light, shimmering like a warning signal of her lingering arrogance. But her smirk was gone, replaced with the subtle tightening of lips and the narrowing of eyes. For the first time that day, she was aware of scrutiny beyond herself. Every diner, every staff member, every witness had taken note of her deliberate act, and now they watched the consequences unfold. Angela did not speak. Her silence was heavier than words. She leaned subtly toward the black waiter, signaling calm and control. Yet her gaze remained fixed on Julia. The quiet authority, radiating from her stance, sent an unmistakable message. Injustice will be observed, and those who impose it will answer. Every second she remained there, unwavering, deepened the tension in the restaurant, making it clear that no act of cruelty would be overlooked. The black waiter straightened imperceptibly, lifting his chin. Though sauce stained his chest and humiliation still simmered, he reclaimed a fragment of dignity with the simple act of standing tall. Angela's presence had shifted something fundamental. He had survived the attack not only physically but psychologically. He could face the room again, no longer shrinking under the weight of a stranger's cruelty. Julia's fingers twitched on her phone. She had expected a swift shock and a swift exit, a momentary disruption followed by the world continuing as usual. But this was not that world. This was a room full of witnesses, a room where authority had intervened, a room where her arrogance was under inspection. Her movements became measured, careful, almost tentative. The diners leaned forward, their whispers a mixture of curiosity and admiration. Some silently celebrated Angela's presence, recognizing the courage it took to confront humiliation, without shouting or aggression. Others watched the black waiter, noting his quiet strength, and the small gestures that spoke, louder than any words could. The straightening of shoulders, the steadying of hands, the refusal to retreat. Angela's gaze never wavered. Every second she stood there reinforced the unspoken truth. Cruelty has limits. Arrogance is never untouchable. And those who seek to demean others must reckon with the consequences, whether immediate or delayed. The silence she maintained carried more weight than any words could have, making the room understand that authority, when exercised with calm decisiveness, leaves no space for injustice to hide. The black waiter exhaled quietly, letting a small measure of relief pass through him. He had survived more than a throne plate. He had survived the public humiliation intended to define him. He felt a sense of quiet empowerment settle in, fragile but undeniable. The room, though still tense, had begun to absorb the lesson being imparted without words, Julia finally rose from her chair, her movements deliberate but strained. She adjusted her red dress, attempting to reclaim the composure she had lost. Yet the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. She was no longer the center of control. That position had been claimed by Angela and, in turn, shared with the black waiter, who now held a quiet authority born of resilience and support. The spilled food, once a mark of her dominance, now symbolized a lesson in accountability. Every diner could see the contrast. Cruelty met with courage, arrogance met with patience, and humiliation met with justice. The black waiter, though still covered in sauce, became a living reminder that dignity cannot be destroyed by the actions of others alone. Angela took a subtle step forward, closing the distance between herself and Julia. Her posture remained calm, her eyes unwavering. The room seemed to recognize the shift, sensing that the confrontation had reached its first pivotal moment. Julia's defiance flickered, her confidence shaken by the realization that someone capable and unafraid, would not allow the unfair treatment to continue unchecked. The black waiter, side by side with Angela, felt a small surge of pride. He realized that standing still, standing firm, and accepting support in moments of vulnerability did not signify weakness. It signified courage. It signified that one could face humiliation and emerge stronger, especially when allies are present and injustice is observed. Whispers continued to ripple through the restaurant, some sympathetic, others critical, but all aware of the moral clarity of the scene. The lesson extended beyond the individuals involved. Cruelty cannot exist unchallenged, and witnessing the act of intervention can inspire those affected to reclaim their dignity. Julia finally sank back into her seat, her fingers still trembling slightly on her phone. She could no longer dominate the room with mere arrogance. She had been measured, judged, and restrained by the quiet, undeniable authority of Angela. The black waiter stood tall beside her, his pride and resilience restored, incrementally by the moral force that had intervened. Angela remained poised, ensuring the lesson was clear. Authority and compassion, exercised with precision, are more powerful than humiliation. Justice does not always shout. Sometimes it simply stands beside the wronged, silently but decisively, letting integrity and principle do the work. The tension slowly began to dissipate, but the lesson lingered. The black waiter was no longer merely a victim of Julia's impulsive cruelty. He had become a symbol of patience, endurance, and the quiet strength that comes from being seen and supported. The restaurant resumed its rhythm, though eyes still flickered toward the scene and whispers continued, softer now, contemplative. The story had begun with a single act of humiliation, but it had evolved into a demonstration of principle, courage, and moral authority. And as the black waiter adjusted his uniform as best he could, sauce still marking his chest, he knew this was only the beginning. Julia's actions would have consequences beyond this moment, and Angela's intervention had ensured that the lessons of courage, justice, and dignity would not be forgotten. Julia sat frozen in her chair, the red dress she had so confidently worn moments ago, now feeling like a shield that could no longer protect her. Her eyes darted nervously around the restaurant, taking in the judgmental glances of other diners and the subtle nods of approval directed toward Angela and the black waiter. Every whisper, every pause in conversation reminded her that her actions had consequences. The air was thick with accountability, a force she had never truly experienced before. The black waiter, though still covered in sauce, stood taller than he had when he first arrived at the table. There was a quiet fire in his chest, a realization that humiliation could be met with dignity, that the weight of cruelty could be deflected by moral strength. Angela's presence beside him had turned the tide. She did not need to speak. Her authority alone had transformed the atmosphere. Angela took a slow, deliberate step toward Julia, and the red-dressed girl felt the shift immediately. The restaurant seemed to pulse with the weight of the moment. It was not anger, not even confrontation. It was moral clarity, a force that judged and corrected without raising a voice. Julia's smirk had long vanished, replaced with the tightness of someone realizing that arrogance and cruelty were never without consequence. The black waiter took a deep breath, He remembered the weeks he had spent working in the restaurant, the long hours, the careful attention to every detail. He had learned to carry himself with pride, even when the world seemed indifferent. But this moment, raw and public as it was, had tested him in a new way. He understood now that pride alone could not shield him from the actions of others. Courage and support were just as vital. Angela's gaze remained steady. She had witnessed many moments like this over the years, yet each one demanded the same resolve. Cruelty, no matter how small, needed to be addressed. It was not enough to scold or reprimand quietly. Intervention was required. And intervention, as she demonstrated, could be quiet, deliberate, and immensely powerful. Julia's fingers fidgeted with the edge of her chair. The whispers of the diners, the judging stares, and Angela's unwavering presence forced her into a moment of reflection. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that actions taken out of arrogance and entitlement left traces far beyond the immediate moment. The plate she had thrown, the stain she had caused, were not just marks on fabric. They were symbols of her disregard for another human being, and those symbols would not be ignored. The black waiter began to regain control over himself. He wiped his hands carefully on a napkin, then adjusted his posture, letting a subtle calmness replace the earlier tremor of shock. His pride, once threatened, now stood taller, reinforced by the moral clarity Angela had brought into the room. This was a lesson in resilience. In the quiet strength of standing firm while the world watches, Angela motioned subtly toward the spilled food, not with anger, but with a gentle authority that demanded acknowledgement. Julia hesitated, then slowly reached for a napkin to begin the awkward process of cleaning up. It was a small act, but it carried weight. Recognition of wrongdoing, even if reluctant, was the first step toward accountability. The diners watched, transfixed. Some whispered words of encouragement to the black waiter, while others murmured about the transformation they were witnessing in Julia. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. What had begun as a simple act of cruelty had evolved into a demonstration of justice, resilience, and moral responsibility. Time seemed to stretch. The black waiter's heart slowed as he absorbed the significance of the moment. He realized that he had been tested, not only by Julia's actions, but by the silence and observation of the entire room. The way he carried himself, the steadiness of his reaction, and the courage to remain upright became a lesson, not only for Julia, but for everyone present. Angela's eyes softened slightly as she looked at him. There was a silent acknowledgement of the strength he had shown, tempered by humility and composure. She had intervened, yes, but the boy's dignity was his own. He had chosen to stand, to endure, and to reclaim a measure of control. Her role was to witness, to guide, and to ensure that justice took root, but the black waiter's resilience was the true force in the room. Julia's red dress now seemed almost garish in the soft light of the restaurant. She shifted in her seat, a visible tension marking her every movement. She had been the agent of humiliation, yet she was forced to confront the consequences in a way that words could not soften. Her arrogance had met a wall of moral certainty, and it left her uncomfortably exposed. The black waiter straightened fully, meeting Julia's gaze with calm eyes. There was no malice there, no desire for revenge, only quiet strength, reinforced by the knowledge that dignity could not be stolen by acts of cruelty. Angela's presence beside him strengthened the message, emphasizing that moral authority could protect and empower even in moments of public disgrace. The diners leaned back slightly, the tension easing but the lesson lingering. This was more than a simple incident. It was a moral statement. Actions, no matter how small or impulsive, have consequences. Arrogance and cruelty are temporary, but resilience, dignity, and justice endure. The black waiter, though marked by the physical evidence of the incident, stood as a symbol of all three. Julia finally lowered her gaze. Her defiance had been challenged, her arrogance questioned, and her sense of entitlement disrupted. She began to grasp that the world did not revolve around her whims, that other people's dignity mattered, and that authority paired with integrity could restore balance. Even when it seemed impossible, Angela's hand rested lightly on the edge of the table, not touching the black waiter, but close enough to offer a sense of security. Her calm presence emphasized the lesson. Intervention does not need to be loud or violent. Sometimes it is enough to stand firmly, to act decisively, and to allow moral clarity to guide the outcome. The black waiter adjusted his uniform as best he could, sauce still marking his chest, yet his composure had returned. He felt a small spark of empowerment, a recognition that resilience could transform even the most humiliating moments into lessons in strength and dignity. The room, once frozen in shock, now buzzed quietly with the understanding that a lesson had been delivered, one that would not soon be forgotten. The restaurant had returned to its ordinary rhythm, but the tension of the afternoon still clung to the air like a shadow. Julia sat quietly in her chair, her red dress no longer a statement of power but a reminder of the consequences she could not erase. Every glance she stole from other diners felt heavy, laden with judgment she could neither ignore nor control. For the first time, she realized that entitlement and arrogance could be challenged, and that the world would notice. The black waiter stood upright, still marked by the spill, yet more composed than before. Each breath he took reinforced the quiet pride that had been shaken moments ago. Angela remained by his side, her yellow dress bright in the soft light, her presence both shield and statement. Together they embodied a lesson Julia could not escape: cruelty, no matter how bold, could meet unwavering resistance and moral authority. Angela's eyes scanned the room, measuring reactions and understanding the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. The diners had regained their composure, but the undercurrent of judgment persisted. It flowed toward Julia, pressing in on her like an invisible weight. She had not expected witnesses. She had not expected consequences to follow her impulsive actions so immediately. The world, she was learning, did not revolve around her whims. The black waiter took a tentative step forward, as though to signal that the ordeal was not yet complete. His uniform remained marked, his pride still tender, but he had regained control over himself in a way that mattered far more than the appearance of perfection. Angela nodded slightly, as if approving the unspoken choice to reclaim dignity in front of everyone who had watched. Julia shifted uncomfortably, sensing the rising tension in the room. Her smirk had vanished entirely. She had expected shock and apology from others, submission from the waiter, and perhaps even amusement from her peers. But the quiet force beside him had turned the situation on its head. Authority, courage, and patience now stood as a wall she could not breach. The diners' whispers grew more deliberate, a mixture of judgment and awe. Some praised the black waiter silently in their minds for standing firm, while others recognized Angela's role as the arbiter of moral balance. Julia felt every gaze like a weight pressing on her, realizing that her actions had consequences beyond the immediate mess on the table and stains on the uniform. Angela stepped closer, her posture calm but unmistakably commanding. Her eyes never left Julia, silently insisting that accountability could not be ignored. Julia, for the first time that afternoon, met her gaze directly, feeling the force of moral authority without a word being spoken. She knew the lesson was unfolding in real time. Her actions were visible, judged, and would carry consequences. The black waiter adjusted his stance subtly. Though he was covered in sauce, his head was held high. Humiliation had tried to take him, but he had chosen to reclaim what mattered: dignity, patience, and the courage to endure public scrutiny without retaliation. Angela's presence amplified that choice, demonstrating that moral authority could stand beside someone even when the world seemed hostile. Julia's face flushed with frustration. She had intended to humiliate, to assert dominance, to prove superiority. Instead, she had encountered resilience, patience, and unspoken justice. Every movement she made felt observed, measured, and weighed. She had underestimated the quiet strength of intervention, the force of moral authority, and the resilience of someone wronged but unwilling to break. Angela motioned subtly toward the table and the mess that remained. Not with anger, but with an air of inevitability. Julia hesitated, then slowly began to gather the remnants of the fallen plate, her movements awkward, reluctant but necessary. Each act of cleaning became a symbol, a recognition of wrongdoing, however grudging, and a lesson in accountability that she could not ignore. The diners leaned forward slightly, caught between fascination and reflection. The incident had become more than a simple act of cruelty. It was a demonstration of principle. The black waiter had endured, Angela had guided, and Julia had begun to confront the consequences of her behavior. Observers could feel the weight of every silent message. Arrogance and cruelty are temporary, but integrity and moral courage endure. The black waiter wiped his hands carefully, keeping his movements deliberate. Though his uniform remained stained, he felt a growing sense of empowerment. He had been humiliated, yes, but that humiliation did not define him. It was a mark of endurance, a reminder that even in the most uncomfortable moments, strength and dignity could emerge. Angela's presence had been the catalyst, a shield of moral authority allowing him to reclaim control in front of a watching world. Julia lowered her gaze, her arrogance now tempered by recognition. She had been the instigator, yet she found herself reflecting on the weight of her actions. The spilled food, the ruined uniform, and the tense silence had all spoken louder than any scolding or reprimand could. She began to understand, faintly but unmistakably, that entitlement was fragile, and cruelty could never escape scrutiny. Angela remained poised, her presence a constant reminder of what moral authority looked like in action. She had shown that intervention did not require harsh words, violence, or dramatic confrontation. Sometimes standing firmly, moving decisively, and letting integrity do the work was enough to shift the balance entirely. The black waiter exhaled quietly, feeling the lesson settle into his bones. Humiliation had arrived, yes, but resilience had followed immediately, carried by moral clarity, and the unwavering support of someone who refused to ignore injustice. The experience, painful as it had been, became a defining moment, a lesson in dignity, endurance, and the subtle, powerful force of accountability. The diners slowly returned to their meals, though the weight of the lesson lingered. Julia remained quiet, her movements deliberate, her arrogance replaced by a cautious awareness of consequence. She could no longer dismiss the actions of others without reflection. And for the first time, she felt the discomfort of recognition that her choices were visible and judged. Angela's eyes softened slightly as she glanced at the black waiter, acknowledging the quiet courage he had shown. He had endured the storm of humiliation, survived the judgment of onlookers, and emerged stronger through patience and resilience. The moral authority that Angela had brought into the room had amplified that strength, creating a moment that would remain in the minds of all who witnessed it. The chapter drew to a close, but the story was far from finished. Julia's reckoning had begun. The black waiter had reclaimed his dignity, and Angela had ensured that the lesson of accountability, courage, and moral authority would resonate far beyond the spilled food. The events of the day had proven that actions have consequences, that cruelty cannot exist unchecked, and that true strength emerges not from retaliation, but from the quiet, unwavering force of integrity. The afternoon faded slowly, but the lesson remained. Humiliation had been confronted, arrogance had been challenged, and justice, subtle yet undeniable, had prevailed. And as the black waiter and Angela stood together, the ripple of their actions promised that the next chapter would carry the weight of resolution, reflection, and inevitable reckoning. The tension that had gripped the restaurant all afternoon began to dissolve slowly, but its mark remained. Julia sat at her table, her red dress no longer a symbol of dominance but a reminder of the consequences she could no longer ignore. Her fingers tapped nervously on her phone, yet she could not escape the weight of judgment around her. Each gaze from the diners, each glance toward the black waiter and Angela, reinforced a lesson she had only just begun to understand. Arrogance carries a cost, and cruelty leaves traces far beyond the moment. The black waiter adjusted his uniform, now marked and worn, but his posture remained tall and confident. Each careful breath, each subtle gesture, carried the quiet dignity he had reclaimed. The spilled sauce on his chest was no longer a symbol of shame, but of endurance and resilience. The presence of Angela had transformed what could have been a moment of humiliation into a testament of moral authority and support. Angela's yellow dress caught the light as she moved, a constant reminder of the force that had intervened earlier. She had demonstrated that authority, and courage do not always need to raise their voice. Sometimes presence alone speaks volumes. Her steady gaze at Julia communicated accountability and moral clarity, showing that actions, no matter how fleeting, can ripple outward and demand recognition. Julia's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of the lesson pressing upon her. She had expected to command the room, to bend others to her will, yet she found herself confronted with something stronger than entitlement: integrity. She now understood, painfully and unmistakably, that humiliation does not end at the act itself. It travels, echoing through witnesses, authority, and the moral fabric of the moment. The black waiter's eyes met hers briefly. There was no anger there, no desire for revenge, only calm strength, quiet resilience, and the dignity of someone who had refused to be broken. Angela's support beside him amplified that strength, ensuring that the consequences of cruelty were visible, undeniable, and immediate. The room had watched, and the lesson had been delivered. Julia shifted in her seat, beginning to clean up the mess she had caused. Each careful movement symbolized acknowledgement, reluctant, perhaps, but present nonetheless. The spilled plate and scattered food had become more than an accident. They were a tangible reminder of the lesson she now faced. Arrogance, she realized, could not withstand accountability when met with moral courage. The black waiter took a moment to breathe, feeling the quiet empowerment that came from surviving public humiliation. The incident had tested him not only physically but emotionally, pushing him to a brink he had never encountered before. And yet he had endured. He had remained upright, composed, and dignified. Angela's presence had been a shield, but the courage he now felt had grown within him, an inner force that no act of cruelty could destroy. The diners slowly resumed their meals, but their attention lingered. Whispers circulated, praise for the black waiter's resilience, admiration for Angela's courage, and reflection on Julia's reckoning. The incident had evolved beyond a simple act of humiliation into a moral lesson for everyone present. The room had witnessed the collision of arrogance and accountability, cruelty and justice, humiliation and resilience. Angela stepped forward slightly, her gaze softening as she looked at the black waiter. Though the uniform was still stained and the evidence of the incident visible, he had reclaimed the dignity that had been threatened. The moral lesson had been clear. Injustice cannot survive when confronted with integrity, and moral authority, exercised with precision, can restore balance even in moments of public chaos. Julia's red dress seemed almost muted now under the soft lighting. Her fingers paused, and she finally met the black waiter's eyes with a flicker of recognition. She had been wrong, and though pride made it difficult to admit, she could feel the weight of the lesson settling in. Actions, no matter how impulsive or thoughtless, have consequences that cannot be ignored. Arrogance may dominate for a moment, but moral authority endures. The black waiter straightened further, his chest rising with a quiet confidence. The humiliation had left its mark, yes, but it no longer defined him. Angela's guidance had transformed a moment of shame into one of empowerment. He had survived, and in surviving, he had grown stronger, more aware and more resilient. The spilled food, the stain on his uniform, the public display, all of it now served as evidence of his endurance, not his weakness. Julia finally stood, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of acknowledgement. She did not speak. No apology came, but the act itself carried weight. She had faced the moral force that Angela represented, and in doing so, she had been forced to confront her own arrogance. The lesson was clear: cruelty, however bold, is always accountable, and dignity cannot be stolen when met with resilience and support. Angela watched silently, her presence unwavering. She had delivered the moral intervention with subtlety and precision. Her role was not to humiliate or punish, but to ensure that the principles of respect, accountability, and integrity were upheld. She had shown the black waiter that he was not alone, and she had shown Julia that actions carry consequences, visible and undeniable. The black waiter inhaled deeply, feeling a sense of closure mingled with the empowerment of moral victory. He had faced public humiliation and emerged not broken but stronger. The experience, though painful, had reaffirmed a truth he had always understood deep within: integrity, patience, and courage can withstand cruelty, and witnessing justice can empower those who are wronged. The restaurant slowly returned to normal rhythm, though the memory of the incident lingered in every glance and whispered comment. The lesson of the day, that cruelty meets accountability, arrogance meets moral authority, and humiliation meets resilience, had left an indelible mark on everyone present. As the afternoon faded, the black waiter adjusted his uniform one last time, accepting the stains as evidence of endurance rather than shame. Angela stood beside him, a constant reminder that moral authority does not shout, it guides. And Julia, now subdued and reflective, understood the power of consequence, the weight of her actions, and the lesson she could not escape. The story that began with a single thrown plate had reached its conclusion, a narrative of accountability, courage, and moral clarity. The black waiter had survived. Angela had intervened with wisdom and strength, and Julia had begun to reckon with the consequences of her arrogance. In the end, dignity and justice had prevailed. Humiliation had been confronted, cruelty had been challenged, and the quiet but undeniable force of integrity had restored balance. The lesson would not be forgotten for the black waiter, for Julia, and for all who had witnessed the events of that afternoon. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Stick with us for more thrilling and moral-driven tales here on Black Says.